There are places in Oxford where time doesn't pass so much as hover. The lecture hall in St. Simeon's, Hall B specifically, was such a place. I remember sitting near the back that afternoon, half hidden by a crooked pillar and the remnants of a chest cold, while a paper on untranslatable concepts in 17th century verse unfolded without passion on the podium below. Words hung in the air like soft lint, gently alighting and then dissolving. I recall none of them now, only the light. The window panes were tall, lead-framed, specked with the residue of a decade's disinterest in cleaning. Sunlight threaded through them in narrow slashes, catching the dust as it rose from unseen surfaces. A shaft of gold fell directly across the aisle, illuminating nothing in particular, but elevating it nonetheless. A cobweb, a half-broken armrest, the ghost of someone who had once waited here to be surprised. There were perhaps 8 of us in the room, mostly faculty, those who needed to be seen to be curious, or whose own lectures were equally ignored in turn. Lewis, mercifully, was elsewhere. I imagine he'd have fidgeted his way through it like a schoolboy at evensong. As for me, I'd come out of obligation rather than interest. The speaker, a newly appointed lecturer from All Souls, had once reviewed a small volume of essays I'd written in the 80s, and I'd felt it only courteous to offer an indifferent nod of support in return. The final slide, a blurry citation about epistemological surrender, flickered briefly before the projector clicked off. A weak ripple of applause. Someone cleared their throat twice and then stood. Coats were gathered, scarves knotted. The academic exodus began without urgency. I stayed. Not because of anything said, but because of something unsaid, or more precisely, overheard. There's a stairwell just below Hall B, a stone curl of steps that leads down to the boiler room and, less usefully, a forgotten cupboard of broken chairs and mispainted signage. As I was gathering my coat, I heard voices rising faintly from there, not loudly and not in anger, but in that particular timbre reserved for unfinished arguments. A woman's voice first, measured, educated, the kind that drops its vowels slightly when the subject grows personal. It should have stayed buried. Then silence, not the silence of agreement nor of defeat, the kind that follows a shared realization, the silence of people remembering at different speeds. I didn't move toward the stairwell. One learns to let secrets approach in their own time. Instead, I lingered, pretending to admire the brass plaque commemorating some half-forgotten benefactor who had once endowed the college with a lecture series on moral conscience and the law. Outside, the air had thickened. November does that in Oxford, the mist not heavy enough to qualify as fog, not light enough to ignore. It lingered in the spaces between things. Even the bicycles, abandoned along the railing, looked temporarily uncertain of their purpose. Later that night, I tried to write a crossword, a small ritual I perform in lieu of sleep. One clue stuck with me: 6 across, concealment in plain sight, 7. I wrote lecture, though it didn't quite fit. It never does at first. There's a particular sound to early morning in Oxford. It isn't silence, not truly, but something gentler, the hush of promise, the unwrapping of day before anyone's quite ready to open it. That morning, as I crossed Radcliffe Square, the air felt heavier than it should have. The sky had the color of unwritten paper, and the cobblestones beneath me seemed uncertain about what they ought to remember. Strange had phoned just after 7, always too brisk, always too awake. There's been a death at St. Simeon's, a lecturer. It could be natural causes, but the college had requested discretion. I hadn't asked who had done the requesting, the kind of formality that reeks faintly of guilt. The porter met us at the main archway, a thin man, upright in posture but with a certain slackness in the eyes. He gestured toward the inner quad with the kind of reverence usually reserved for chapel processions. His voice, when it finally emerged, said only that they'd found Dr. Wickmere in Lecture Hall, B. Allen Wickmere. I knew the name. Everyone did. a senior lecturer in moral philosophy, known for his surgical logic and chronic disdain for sentiment. The sort of man who considered clarity a virtue and tact a defection. Brilliant, no doubt, and profoundly alone, though he would never have used the word. We followed the porter through corridors that smelled of varnished oak and old paper. Lecture Hall B sat at the far end of the southern wing, half sunken into the ground, as if the building itself regretted having to house it. The air inside still held yesterday's breath. That combination of chalk, damp wool, and ambition. He was there, seated behind the lectern as though waiting for a late-arriving question. Eyes closed, one arm draped slightly off to the side as if reaching for something no longer there. No sign of struggle, no immediate clue. Only stillness, the kind that cannot be misread. Lewis crouched beside the body, gloves already on. He said the doctor's wristwatch had stopped at 9:42. No indication as to when that had occurred, only that it had. No spilt tea, no disorder. Just a man who had, it seemed, come to rehearse a lecture and found instead the end of himself. I walked to the blackboard. The eraser had done its work, but not well. The faintest outline of a sentence lingered in chalk dust. I leaned in. Only one word was clear enough to read. Regret. It could have been a quotation, or a prompt, or a warning, depending on who had written it and why. The porter said Dr. Wickmere had been scheduled to deliver a major address later that week. A special lecture, open to the public. The poster was still tacked to the college notice board outside. I stopped before it on our way back through the quad. Its serifed letters had the quiet confidence of institutional print. Public lecture by Dr. Alan Wickmere. The Ethics of Concealment, Thursday, 7 p.m. Lecture Hall. The irony struck me, but I kept it to myself. On the opposite side of the board, someone had scrawled a line in biro, faint, almost apologetic. Some truths deserve silence. I asked the porter who'd written it. He said he hadn't noticed, but his glance drifted left toward the stairwell below, the same one I'd stood above the day before. Back at the station, I opened the Times crossword. A small ritual, again. Today's puzzle had a theme. All the clues led to synonyms of silence. 8 down, unheard, but never unspoken, 7. I didn't write an answer just yet. Wickmere had chosen a subject he must have known would unsettle. Concealment, ethics. In Oxford, there are few things more dangerous to speak of openly, especially if you no longer intend to keep them hidden. There are certain women in Oxford whose presence seems to be stitched directly into the stonework. Not loud, not even visible to the casual passerby, but felt in the way a draught passes beneath a closed door. Dr. Cecilia Vane was one of those. Deputy Warden of St. Simeon's, Senior Fellow in Medieval Textual Ethics, and, more curiously, the only person who had both publicly defended and privately contradicted Alan Wickmere in the last faculty meeting, a fact noted in minutes but never in conversation. Lewis and I were shown to her rooms in the West Range. The porter, who clearly feared her in the respectful way one might fear a retired head mistress with unspoken powers, knocked gently and withdrew. The air inside was dry with a scent of old bindings and faintly floral hand cream, the kind my mother once used, pale and impossible to find now. She didn't rise when we entered, merely gestured to 2 chairs with the quiet efficiency of someone used to managing committee rooms and silences. She wore grey, layered like punctuation, and gloves. Not leather, not for warmth, but soft velvet. A peculiar choice for indoors, and one she made no move to remove. She said she was saddened, of course, though her voice held no tremor. Alan had been many things, exacting, impatient, unkind at times. But his brilliance had made his flaws seem necessary. I asked whether they had been close. She considered, then said once, long ago, they had admired the same things, that now she was mostly his footnote. Lewis asked whether Wickmere had mentioned any worries, any threats. She said no, but her left hand, gloved and unmoving, tightened minutely against the armrest. I asked about the lecture, the ethics of concealment. Did she know what he'd planned to say? She smiled, that mild academic kind of smile that both invites and withholds. She said he'd spoken vaguely, hinting at historical cases, misremembered scandals, and philosophical abstractions. But that was Alan, always dressing wounds in theory. She rose then, moving to a shelf and retrieving a narrow leather-bound book. She handed it to me. Said Wickmere had returned it just last week. A commentary on Abelard, with marginal notes that weren't hers. The margins were filled with Wickmere's hand, but something was wrong. His script was usually severe, black ink, tidy, unornamented. But here, the notes looped with unexpected elegance, the kind that came from copying something older, or someone else. One note caught my eye, a phrase circled twice, suffered not for the truth, but for its failure to arrive on time. I asked her what she made of that. She said she didn't know, but I saw, in the way she replaced the book, that she did. Lewis wandered to the window and noted aloud that the view overlooked Lecture Hall. B. Vane didn't turn, said she preferred not to look down. Before we left, I asked one more question, whether she remembered the phrase, "Some truths deserve silence." Her eyes lingered a moment too long on mine. Then she said that sounded like something Alan might have said, but I hadn't asked whether he'd said it, only whether she remembered it. Back outside, the clouds had lowered. A fine mist had begun to gather along the roof lines. Lewis exhaled quietly, the breath hanging like a question. "She's hiding something," he said. I agreed. "But not from us. Not entirely." He asked about the gloves. "To cover something," I said, "or to avoid leaving fingerprints on the past." It was Lewis who found it, though he'd modestly insist otherwise. He'd been rooting through the archives with the haphazard thoroughness of someone who didn't quite trust the system, but hadn't the time to dismantle it properly. St. Simeon's College had kept its records in the same filing cabinets since the late 1940s, a detail I found both comforting and incriminating. Oxford loves memory, but only when it can curate it. He brought the envelope to me with the reverence one might reserve for a relic found behind a church panel. It had been tucked, not filed, inside an exam script from 1937, a Latin translation on Boethius that had clearly never been marked. The envelope, thin and speckled with foxing, bore no name, just a penciled scrawl on the flap, 1972. Inside, a photograph. 4 young people standing outside Lecture Hall B, their faces frozen in the kind of posthumous sincerity that only surfaces when one believes the moment won't matter. Wickmere was recognizable even then, lean, sharply folded into himself, his expression already lined with quiet disapproval. To his left, Dr. Cecilia Vane, younger, less severe, though even then holding her hands the way one guards something precious or dangerous. The other 2 were unknown to me. A tall man with sideburns and the bored confidence of minor privilege. A woman in a rust-colored cardigan, arms folded, eyes squinting directly into the sun. On the back, a sentence in faded ink. "The pact holds." No signature, no date. But the handwriting, the gentle slope of the S, the soft dip in the H, suggested a woman's hand and a certain practiced caution. Lewis asked whether it meant anything to me. I said not yet, but I doubted it would stay that way. We took the photograph back to Wickmere's rooms. His quarters hadn't been cleared yet. Oxford doesn't rush the dead, and they still smelled faintly of peppermint and old tobacco. The desk bore the subtle arrangement of a man not expecting to return, but unwilling to admit it. Lecture notes, a half-crossed puzzle, the morning's Guardian folded on the cryptic. I studied the crossword while Lewis looked over the shelves. One clue caught me. 15 down, bound by word, broken by time. 4. I tried vow, then changed it to oath. Neither felt wrong. Lewis called me over. He'd found a folder mislabeled Property Returns. Inside, nothing about leases or keys, only a copy of a college program from 1972. The lecture series was titled Disruptions and Continuities, Ethics in Transition. One name stood out, Simon Thale. Lecturer. Topic, the politics of concealment. I underlined the word. There it was again. Concealment. Repeating, circling back. Not a coincidence. Not in Oxford. Here, repetition is a kind of warning. We returned the photograph to the envelope and left the archive room quietly. The wind had picked up outside, rustling the high tree branches that framed the quad like a thought encroaching on memory. I walked a little behind Lewis, letting the image settle in my mind. 4 figures. A pact, Wickmere and Vane side by side. Had there been love once? Or something less tender, more enduring? Shared culpability, perhaps. Affection forged through silence. Back in my flat, I poured a whiskey and sat with the photograph under the amber desk lamp. The woman in the cardigan, her eyes had something in them. Not defiance, not quite regret. Something quieter, a kind of tired vigilance, as if she'd never stopped watching for what might return. The clue still sat in my head. Bound by word, broken by time. 4. I tried again. This time I wrote pact and left it there, unanswered. Some names are like half-remembered verses. They hover, unresolved, just out of reach until heard again in the wrong context. Simon Thale was one of those. A poet once, briefly lauded in pamphlets with frayed edges, and later a publisher with a tendency to disappear between convictions. I hadn't thought of him in years. Oxford rarely forgets its own, but it has its own methods for shelving them. I found him in a converted townhouse on St. Bernard's Road, one of those pale brick places with too many keys and too little warmth. The bell didn't work. I knocked instead, twice. On the 3rd attempt, the door opened a fraction, and Thale stood there, older, bearded, too thin, and wearing an expression like someone expecting a summons from a ghost. He didn't invite me in, not exactly, but left the door open long enough for me to follow. His flat smelled faintly of pipe ash and overwatered plants. Books lined the walls in untidy ranks. A few were his. Most weren't. He poured tea into mismatched mugs without asking and gestured toward an armchair with the stuffing emerging at the corners. I sat. He didn't. He said he'd heard about Alan. That was all. No condolences, no questions. Just the name, placed into the room like a stone in a quiet pool. I asked how long he'd been back. 3 weeks, he said. College was offering him a temporary fellowship. Something about rehabilitating voices from the margins. He made a face as he said it, as though the phrase had grown mold in his mouth. I asked if he'd seen Wickmere since his return. He said no. But there was a pause, too slight for someone who used to lecture on rhythm and cadence. Then a shrug, as if that might undo the moment. I told him I'd seen the 1972 photograph. Mentioned the 4 of them. His eyebrows lifted just enough to register the memory. He said it had been a different world, full of anger disguised as theory and affection disguised as ethics. Said they'd all believed in exposure back then, until they realized some truths made too poor an audience. I asked what the pact had been. He said he didn't know, said that wasn't his handwriting. Another pause. He walked to the window and looked out at the street as though expecting someone to walk past and prove him wrong. Then, almost casually, he misquoted Auden, a line about truth being what survives silence. I let it pass. But later, when I was back at the car, I opened my notebook and wrote the actual line in the margin. Truth, like love, survives only in being spoken. Thale's version had replaced spoken with buried. I circled it twice. Inside the flat, He offered one more thing, unsolicited. Said Alan had once believed in revelation, that he'd been planning something even then in 1972. A lecture or a publication, or perhaps just a moment of honesty that never found its hour. Then he said something I hadn't expected, that Cecilia had been the one to stop it. Not in any dramatic sense, no threats, no scenes. Just a conversation in the dark outside Lecture Hall B, where she'd told Alan that sometimes the truth, when spoken, doesn't free anyone. It just rearranges the weight. And Alan, Thale said, had listened. I asked whether he believed that. Thale smiled. That old half-smile poets wear when they're not sure what a word means anymore. I asked one last question, whether Helen Garside had been part of it. This time, the pause was real. Not performative, not rhetorical. He said he didn't remember, and then he asked me to leave. Outside, the mist had begun to settle again, soft and indiscriminate, the kind that coats everything in the same quiet grey. Back at my flat, I opened the day's crossword again. I hadn't touched it since morning. 4 across. When a voice returns without echo, 5. I stared at it for a long while. Then wrote, Thale. There's something oddly theatrical about a locked door. It suggests boundaries, secrets, something behind it worth containing. But an unlocked door, that carries its own quiet menace. The absence of resistance where one expects it. A failed hinge of certainty. Lecture Hall. B, according to the porter's log, had been locked at precisely 8:04 p.m. on the evening before Wickmere was found. He had initialed the register with his usual looping G, as consistent as the man himself. But when Lewis and I reviewed the CCTV footage from the side entrance, a luxury the college had begrudgingly installed last year after a donor's handbag went missing, there it was, a figure at 10:37 p.m., slipping in. No clear features. Just a coat too long for summer and too loose for winter, and no key used. The door opened like it had been waiting. I revisited the hall that morning, alone. It was still empty, still ghosted with the after-image of Wickmere's final rehearsal. The podium bore the faint outline of his notes, a few dots of ink where the pen had hesitated, then continued. The blackboard had been wiped, but not entirely. Under the right light, you could still read the faintest chalk trace of a word he hadn't had time to finish. It started with an R. Perhaps reveal, or retract, or simply regret again. I stood behind the lectern and looked out, imagining his last breath in this room, how the silence must have fallen so quickly, so privately. Death is never dramatic when it's expected. It just arrives with the air and doesn't leave. I walked the length of the room, letting my fingertips trail against the wall. At the back, behind the final row of benches, there's a narrow door, unmarked, recessed into the wood paneling. It leads nowhere important. A cupboard, really. Used, I was told, for spare stools and the emergency fan no one remembers to retrieve in summer. But the handle, brass and worn, turned too easily. And inside, amidst the usual neglect, was a strip of masking tape on the interior of the panel. Something had once been attached there. Recently, the glue residue was still fresh enough to catch a fingernail. I looked down. On the floor, barely visible beneath the fan's crooked base, a folded scrap of card, thick, watermarked, half burnt at the corner, the sort of thing you'd slip into a first edition. I bent and picked it up. The ink was faded but legible. A brief line, handwritten. To forgive, you must first forget. No name, no context. But the handwriting was familiar. I'd seen it in a marginalia just days before. Wickmere's copy of Abelard, annotated but not quite his own. I took the card back into the light. The reverse side had the college's crest embossed. This was no scrap. It had come from the wardens, stationery, the kind reserved for formal apologies or soft threats. Someone had repurposed it, or answered something with it. Lewis arrived 20 minutes later, carrying 2 paper cups of tea and the Guardian tucked under his arm. He asked what I was looking for. I told him I wasn't sure yet, just following the absence of a lock. He sat, sipped, then handed me the crossword. Said he couldn't get past 14 across. 14 across. Left ajar and full of consequence. 4. I stared at it for a while. The clue didn't want to be solved just yet. Back in my office that night, I placed the card under the desk lamp and stared at the writing until it lost meaning. Forgive. Forget. The usual duet. But in Oxford, forgetting is rarely honest. It's curated, archived, masked as misplacement. I glanced at the crossword again and finally wrote it in, quietly. Door. There are nights when Oxford holds its breath, when the spires and weathered lanes seem to listen more than echo. This was such a night. A low fog had slipped across Radcliffe Square, wrapping the stones in a kind of reticence. I remember thinking that even the gargoyles looked less inclined to mock. The wine had been poured too generously, too early, and by someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Jeremy Latchford had always possessed that particular talent, the unspoken calculus of hospitality and manipulation. We'd both sat finals in the same year. He'd worn his tie looser, smiled quicker, carried an air of disheveled conviction that suggested genius or madness or the kind of privilege that never had to choose between the two. He greeted me as though we were picking up a conversation paused just yesterday, though decades and disappointments had intervened. The dining room of his house on St. John's Street was overly warm, perfumed faintly with cardamom and wine tannin and some older trace. Something leather-bound and forgotten. He asked if I remembered the Dvorak recital at Exeter. I lied and said yes. He asked what I thought of Wickmere's demise. I told him I hadn't yet decided what to think. The table was set for 2, but 3 candles flickered between us. Always the dramatist Latchford. The third flame cast a faint halo behind the decanter, giving the illusion of something sanctified. He poured slowly, as if buying time. I waited. He said he hadn't spoken to Wickmere in over a year. Then he corrected himself. No, it was last Michaelmas, briefly, about funding for the manuscript digitization. Nothing consequential. A handshake, a comment about the weather, the usual choreography. But there was a shift. The second glass of wine brought it. His hand, as it reached for the carafe again, lingered just a second too long over the rim, fingertips tracing the edge as if remembering a name he couldn't quite voice. He asked if I'd been to the senior common room recently. Said the new porter had misplaced 3 books from the reserved shelf. One of them, incidentally, had been Wickmere's, an annotated Phaedrus, dog-eared at the passage on Soulmates. Jeremy chuckled then. Said it was a romantic choice for a man who once wrote an essay entitled The Absence of Desire in Classical Rhetoric. The wine was good. Better than I was used to, and that made me wary. I asked him why he'd invited me, really. He looked out the window for a long moment, then turned and said quietly, because the past has sharp corners, and Wickmere always pressed too close to them. There it was. Not quite confession, not quite defense. Just the shape of something unspoken, offered like a shadow on the tablecloth. He poured again. This time the bottle made no sound, just the hush of liquid accepting its fate. There was a photograph on the sideboard. 3 men in scarves. Snow behind them, all smiling if a little warily. Wickmere in the center. Jeremy on the left, and the third man. I leaned closer. Simon Thiel. That moment stilled something inside me. He noticed my gaze and said, "Ah, yes, Davos. 93. Wickmere tried to convince the lot of us that Wittgenstein had been misread on purpose. We argued through 3 countries, never really stopped, but his voice had faltered when he said Thiel's name. I didn't mention it. Not then. Back in my flat that night, I uncorked my own bottle. Something inferior and slightly bitter. The crossword lay open beside it. 11 down, blood shared across old lines. 7. I stared at it for some time, then wrote, almost absently, Aligia. A misspelling, I thought. Or perhaps not. The root was there, a hint of loyalty strained through time, veined with old misgivings. I sat in the dark for a while after that, listening to the room settle into silence. Some glasses hold more than wine. Some toasts are made to what cannot be forgiven. Some clues do not arrive with fanfare or flourish. They reside instead in the margins, in the footnotes of a life lived too carefully or a text read too quickly. And yet it is often there, in the overlooked, that things begin to stir. It was raining again, as it always seems to do when reflection sets in. A rain not fit for poetry. No thunder or tragic lashing. Just the kind that softens stone, makes cobbles glisten, and turns the collar of a coat into a soggy confession. I had returned to the college archives not from necessity, but restlessness. There are days when one feels watched not by people, but by questions. The assistant archivist, a thin young man with anxious spectacles and an apologetic gait, handed me the manuscript Wickmere had been editing, an unpublished monograph on late Renaissance diplomatic rhetoric, tedious to most, obsessive to a few, the kind of thing that lives longer than its author, quietly, on a forgotten shelf. The title page had been inscribed in Wickmere's hand, for those who listen beneath the silences. He had always had a taste for drama, though cloaked in footnotes and conditional clauses. I read slowly. Not for content, but for noise. An annotation here, a circle there. At page 147, a comment in pencil, the lead smudged slightly as though added in haste or with hesitation. It read, "But what if the envoy lies?" That line would not leave me. It was followed, curiously, by a footnote, numbered 67, but there was no corresponding note at the bottom of the page. Just the number, lonely, like a seat left unclaimed at high table. The next 3 pages bore no note 67 either. In fact, they skipped cleanly from 66 to 68. A printer's error, or a withdrawal. I returned the manuscript to the archivist and asked whether a typescript copy might exist. He looked faintly alarmed by the idea of exertion, then confessed that a carbon version had once been filed under the correspondence series due to a cataloging mix-up. I told him I quite liked cataloging mix-ups. They were more honest than the systems that claimed not to err. He reappeared 20 minutes later, clutching a file that looked as if it had slept under something heavy. He handed it to me like contraband. I found the relevant section, and there it was. Footnote 67, restored. See Thale, S. Letter to J.L., 14th of July, 1993. Emphasis on the omissions rather than the admissions. The margins of diplomacy are always more lethal than its center. It was not a declaration, nor even a revelation, but it was enough. I walked to the Bodleian in the drizzle, my coat collar beginning to curl at the edges. Inside, the smell of old bindings and floor polish felt more reassuring than any conversation. I requested the correspondence files of Simon Thal, what remained of them at least. The woman behind the counter wore earrings shaped like quills and had the kind of silence that suggested competence. The letter from July was there, typewritten with a single correction in blue ink. The word glancing changed to dodging, a choice not of elegance, but guilt, perhaps. It spoke of Wickmere obliquely, of a weekend in Geneva, of a conversation between 3 men and 1 translator. It warned, gently, that certain truths were more decorous when left untranslated. Then, abruptly, it ended. There was no signature, just initials, S.T. But it was the envelope that caught me. Folded inside the file, its flap sealed back down with old adhesive, it had been misaddressed. Jeremy Latchford's surname had been typed with an extra H. Latchford. The sort of error that only occurs when one is trying to forget a name as one writes it. Later that evening, I filled a glass and opened the crossword. 3 down. Margin of error. 8. I stared, then penciled in footnote. It was imperfect, a clue more thematic than precise. But so was the world. The glass tasted of black currant and regret. I let the night settle around me, rain pattering the window pane with the soft persistence of memory. Some letters are written to be found. Others are footnotes in someone else's guilt. And sometimes it's only in the forgotten things that the whole begins to show through. There's a certain rhythm to lies, I've noticed. Not in their content, but their cadence. A false confession doesn't stumble where it ought to. It glides too smoothly over the stones of guilt. I've spent a life listening to such music, but it was in the silences between notes that truth most often trembled. He came in near dusk, the kind of hour when Oxford begins to vanish into itself. Lanterns glowing faintly in the mist, students scuttling under archways, pigeons hunched like secrets atop college gates. His name was Langdon Meach, a former porter at Wickmere's College. Broad-shouldered, red-knuckled, eyes like puddles after rain. He had been drinking, but only just. Enough to loosen his resolve, not enough to obscure it. He said he'd killed Jeremy Latchford, that Wickmere had asked him to, not in so many words, but with the sort of cruelty that comes dressed in politeness, that Latchford had known something, had threatened something, had deserved something, that he, Meach, had pushed him into the chair-well and stood over the reeds until the water stopped moving. It was a strangely neat tale. I watched him speak and thought of an old lecture I once heard on tragedy. In true tragedy, the victim must, in some way, choose their fate, however unknowingly. But Meach's tale had no such weight, no inevitability, just a bluntness. Performative, like a schoolboy confessing to a mischief he didn't commit, hoping to impress with his courage. I let him talk. I nodded. I offered whiskey I didn't intend for him to drink. Then I asked a question, simple and offhand. What color was the scarf? He blinked. Which scarf? The one Latchford always wore? Wickmere mentioned it. Said it was hideous. Meach hesitated. Blue? I smiled and thanked him. It was maroon, and he'd never worn it. Only Wickmere said he had. A detail invented, repeated, and believed. Meach had absorbed it like damp, but Latchford had never owned such a thing. When Meach left, I sat for a long time by the window, listening to the low throb of the city's breath. The bells from Magdalene echoed half-heartedly, as if rung by someone unsure they should be heard. False confessions are their own kind of theatre. They seek absolution, not justice. A man like Meach did not need to be guilty to feel he was. He merely needed a cause, something to bleed for. Wickmere had given him that, intentionally or not. Back in my rooms, I found an old notebook, one I used to keep when cases began to blur. There, wedged between 2 lists of references, was a crossword clue I jotted down weeks ago. Untrue claim of guilt? 5, 10. I had stared at it once for an hour and found nothing. That night, the answer arrived like an afterthought. False confession. I wrote it in pencil, as though I didn't quite trust it to stay. The next morning, I visited the chapel where Wickmere once sang tenor in his youth. The organ was being tuned. A slow, patient process, like trying to coax meaning from the past. The chaplain remembered him well. Said he had a way of pausing just before the Amen, as if to give doubt its due moment. I asked if Wickmere ever spoke of Meach. Only once, she said, after evensong. He'd said Meach was the kind of man you could lean on, even if it broke him. I thanked her. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the stones still wept beneath the hedges. Oxford's griefs are subtle and rarely dry. Back at the station, Meach was already waiting, sober now, hallowed. He said he wanted to retract his statement, said it had been a dream or a mistake, or both, that Latchford didn't deserve it, neither the death nor the story. I let him speak. I said very little. Some truths, when falsely claimed, leave a wound of their own, and some men bleed more for sins they never committed than for those they did. When he left, I turned again to the window. The sky was a hard, expressionless grey. Somewhere beneath it, the real story, whatever that meant, waited, still unsaid. And so I poured a drink I wouldn't finish and reopened the notebook. I erased false confession, not because it was wrong, but because it was too neat. There's something about empty lecture halls that unnerves me. Perhaps it's the echo, that long, lingering murmur of minds trying to impress, seduce, or outwit. The chalk dust settles over ambitions, the slow decay of certainty in the polished grain of the podium. We forget how many lies are spoken in places built for truth. It was a Tuesday morning when I returned to Wrenbury Hall. The place smelt of old varnish and overdue readings. I could hear the rain lightly ticking against the leaded panes like a clock set to no particular hour. No one had taught there in over a month. Not since Latchford's last seminar had trailed off, halfway through a quotation from Donne, never to be completed. I'd come looking for a margin, something small and out of place, the kind of detail the guilty always forgets they've left behind. The desk at the front was clean, too clean. Academic desks are never clean at once. They're littered with memory, notes, paperclips, lukewarm tea. But this one looked like it had been scrubbed with purpose. Only one thing remained, a thin paperback tucked inside the hollow beneath. The spine cracked gently as I opened it. A dialogue on the nature of forgiveness, edited by someone with more degrees than readers. It wasn't Latchford's copy. His name wasn't in it. But someone else's was. D. Wickmere, inked not in the confident hand of ownership, but the delicate self-effacement of someone afraid their thoughts might be overheard. I stood still for a long while. A gust from the stairwell stirred the edge of the window curtain, and the room felt less like a place of learning and more like a confession interrupted. There was a pencil note on page 47. 2 words underlined twice. He knew. The margins offered no context. Just a line in a sea of philosophical ponderings on guilt and grace. But it felt less academic than desperate. Not the comment of a reader, but of a man staking his survival on the anonymity of literature. Later, over a slow lunch in the quad, ham sandwiches and a glass of something French enough to be overpriced, I asked the college secretary when Wickmere had last borrowed the lecture keys. She seemed reluctant to answer, as though the question itself carried risk. Eventually, she relented. 2 days after Latchford died, she said he'd wanted to collect a manuscript he'd lent to Jeremy, a minor essay on Milton, if memory serves. I let her believe I was satisfied with the answer, but I remembered Latchford's library. Spare, austere, too tidy. A man who borrowed books and never returned them did not live like that. That afternoon I sat in my car and listened to the rain bead across the roof, the kind of soft percussion that seems to apologize for existing. I lit a cigarette I didn't want and thought about Wickmere. The page, the note. He knew. I'd heard Wickmere say something once about books, that they were safer than people because they confessed without being asked. But some confessions, I've learned, are left too late or left too early, scribbled in margins, hidden in cupboards, whispered in corridors, where they blur into dust and memory. That evening, I went to hear a guest lecture at Balliol, something on medieval truth-telling and the architecture of lies. The speaker wore his learning like armor. But in the second row, near the aisle, I noticed a student with ink on her fingertips, pressing them into her notebook as if to remember by touch alone. Something in her gesture echoed the note on Wickmere's page, the urgent, unshared knowledge of someone trying not to be complicit in silence. Afterwards, I walked alone through Broad Street. The light was fading. The silhouettes of bicycles leaned like punctuation against the railings. I stopped outside the lecture hall again, staring up at the dark windows. There is no evidence, I thought, that guilt makes men careful. Only quiet. And then I remembered something Latchford had once said during a pub quiz at the Eagle and Child, the week before his death. He had missed the final question, a quotation from Paradise Lost. He'd looked puzzled, then amused, said he'd lent that edition to someone, that he ought to have remembered. And now I wonder if he had, and if remembering had cost him more than the point. I've often thought that concealment is not a matter of morals, but of timing. We all hide, the virtuous with shame, the guilty with cunning, the lonely with ceremony, and the cleverest among us with silence. The day was overcast, and not just in the sky. I remember the rain tracing pale tributaries down the panes of the old Radcliffe offices, a kind of ghostwriting upon glass. Strange how water moves like memory, smudging outlines. I had returned to see Dr. Wickmere, not as a detective to suspect. That weary pas de deux had long since lost its tempo, but as one man who understood regret to another who had studied it. He wore his usual cardigan, sleeves fraying at the elbows, as though time had rubbed itself raw against him. We spoke not of the investigation, but of a broader discomfort, the way truth, once uncovered, refuses to lie flat again. He said something then that I have never forgotten. Some concealments are more ethical than their revelations. I remember watching his hands as he said it, not fidgeting, not rehearsing, simply resting. It was a kind of stillness I rarely trust. Outside, a bicycle bell rang twice, high and fast. A student passing, late for something trivial perhaps. But in the hush that followed, I remembered the sound from another day. The same rhythm, the same haste. The day Latchford fell. At the time I dismissed it, the ambient music of Oxford life. But now, seated across from Wickmere, it seemed almost choreographed. Not accidental, but accidental looking. I excused myself after 10 minutes. He seemed neither relieved nor concerned, just folded back into his own silence. The street was slick, the cobbles whispering under my shoes. I turned into an alley that smelled of mushrooms and rust, the kind of damp that blooms only near forgotten gates. A narrow door, one I hadn't noticed before, stood open half an inch. There was no lock on it, just an old brass handle, thumb-worn. It led, improbably, into the undercroft beneath St. Boniface. Storage, by the looks of it. Broken lecterns, disused hymnals, dust in the shape of absence. And there, tucked between two hymn-boards, was the black umbrella. Latchford's, with the silver handle that looked like a bishop's crook. He hadn't had it the day he died. That had puzzled me once. A man who never went anywhere without it, leaving it behind. I'd assumed forgetfulness, or perhaps a second umbrella I didn't know about. But here it was. Shelved, not dropped. Deliberate. I crouched beside it and found a speck of wax on the floorboards. Pale yellow. Church candle wax. Recently fallen, not the right season for ceremonies, but then neither was murder. It came together, not as fact, but as a mood. Wickmere's comment, the bicycle bell. The umbrella returned, not lost. Someone had staged the scene with great care, but not carelessness. It had been done to protect someone, or something. Back in my flat, I stared at the crossword in the Times. 13 down. A virtue betrayed when words outpace wisdom. 7. The answer was secrecy, though I considered justice before rejecting it. I thought of Dr. Wickmere and the way his eyes didn't quite match his words. Not deception, exactly. Something deeper, a kind of ethical fatigue. He had known something. Perhaps not the act itself, but the architecture around it. Enough to misdirect or to delay. Enough to protect someone he loved or feared or owed. And I had done the same once. It had been a woman with dark hair and an unfinished thesis on Eliot. She had lied to me about something trivial, a library fine or a date. I can't quite remember now, but I had not pursued it, because the lie, whatever it was, had been spoken with such fragility that to press it would have broken something else, something less easily repaired. Not all lies are barriers. Some are bridges. So I put down my pen and left the crossword unfinished. The rain was still falling. In the distance, a bell chimed 6 times. Not midnight, but near enough in the soul. And I wondered, not for the first time, whether solving a thing always improves it.